Good afternoon. Hi. I'm going to ask you to just do a little bit of time travel with me for a moment, all right? It's August 26th, 1968. You're a 19-year-old college student, and all of your friends have traveled to Chicago to take part in the Democratic National Convention where they are organizing protests. You have decided to stay home. Instead, to make your own anti-war posters, grab your Olympus pen camera and take photographs of yourself with the sign. It's 1978. You're sitting in the kitchen. You're having a cup of Sanka. The light looks beautiful. It's coming through the spider plant in the window. And you are overtaken by a moment of aesthetic bliss and brand loyalty. You grab the Sanka jar, you sit it next to your cup, you go and you grab your Instamatic 110 camera, you come back to the table, you snap a shot of your coffee. It's 1982. You have taken up jogging, and you feel very good about yourself, and you look good too. Now, you go and you grab your brand new Polaroid Super Color camera. You run up to the bathroom, you rip off your shirt, you look at the mirror, you point the camera, you make sure your head's not in the shot. Take a photograph of your torso. Now, I am presenting these kind of absurd ideas to give you some sense of how radically we have changed as a culture in our own relationship to the photograph. So after photography, the linguistics of online image exchange. Today I want to discuss the photograph, specifically how the photograph has shifted from being a discrete visual, aesthetic, and compositional operation to take on the form of language. So what is online image exchange? Well, online image exchange is the cacophony of imagery that populate the internet, that traffic social media, and that occupy the space of our most widely used apps. It ranges from the caustic to the comedic. It takes on deeply personal and radically political forms. It constitutes a vast vernacular of communication styles, structures, and strategies. How did we get here? Well, the 20th century, in short, was an era defined by photography. Now, to make that simple, I'm going to break that into three major components: personal photography, commercial photography, and informational photography. Personal photography is defined by an image that is understood or legible by the subject or those related to the subject. It inhabited spaces such as family albums, picture frames at home, wallets. Commercial photography has always operated entirely differently. Commercial photography has always coexisted with commercial language, populated magazines, billboards, newspapers. Commercial photography has always been in cahoots or worked in tandem with capitalism. One way of looking at it would be to see it as the baton leader in the capitalist band. The third is informational photography, primarily defined by photojournalism. Photojournalism has had the duty and the role of recording our society, benchmark events, epic scenarios. Photojournalism has functioned in a way to act as a form of proof, even in the face of denial of certain activities. However, if we take a much broader view of photography in the 20th century, we could create a binary. That binary might be looked at as private photography and public photography. Private photography has occupied the personal spaces of the individual, and public photography, all-encompassing, has operated and trafficked in the commons. So let's look at where photography initially and most radically has transformed. The personal photograph, if we were going to create a certain taxonomy of personal photography, could be defined in a series of different groups. Family photographs, special personal events, such as the first time you rode a bike or when you got a new car. Photos of you and your friends taken by you or perhaps taken by your parents when you were young. Recorded memories of an individual's life feeding into the archive of a family, genealogy, and individual's legacy. Let's take one of those groups, a group that I think is the best example of major transformation, the couple photograph. Let's create a sense of narrative for how this photograph, which is absolutely ubiquitous throughout the 20th century, may take place. That couple might invite you to their house, visit their family, or have their family visit them. Maybe they're a new couple. Maybe they just got engaged. Maybe they're newlyweds. Maybe they just moved into their first home. However it is, a common structure took place, commonly or usually in a living room. The couple together getting photographed by a third party. The camera pointed at them, and that person usually saying, say, I love you. How did that transform, and in what way did that photograph manifest differently from that period in time to the present? Well, let's look at a progression of the idea of the couple. So I have 6 images here. The real, let's call them our real couple. They're really there. That's really a house. They're really getting photographed. It's a real moment. Their posture is stiff. Somebody is recording them for posterity. Then let's look at synthetic. I've chosen Mike and Carol Brady here for any of you who don't recognize them. But it could be really any parallel popular form at any given time throughout history. Mike and Carol Brady are the product of fictional narrative. They are produced. They are art directed. They are made and presented through wardrobe. The third is the supersynthetic. Now this, in this case, would be a stock image. What's different between the supersynthetic and the synthetic is that the supersynthetic is an empty vessel following similar rules, but not reifying or reinforcing the notion of that narrative. It sits in wait for some form of commercial use to apply it. The third is the hyperreal. In this case, I have Leanne and Eddie, which is a reality television show. This hyperreal is the convergence in representation of a real couple in a synthetic or staged, produced, art-directed, and wardrobed environment. Then the hybrid synthetic, which is a form of the same synthetic that we might look at as the sitcom in terms of general representation of couple, in a post-digital era, where the fourth wall is broken with 2 main strategies. One, the embracing of capitalism by having product placement, so they use what we use, and the introduction of technology wherein their internet is our internet. Their life is our life, slowly blurring the lines. The sixth is hybrid reality. That hybrid reality is a manifestation of all of those progressive iterations that have affected our sense of self so that we have come out on the other end as a very different product in our understanding of who we are and, let's say, what we are as a couple. It also is the intersection of individuals who have private lives and celebrities who live very public lives. Now, this is not as simple as the notion of the selfie. It's far more complex than that if we allow ourselves to read and decode the entirety of images. So let's look at a progression throughout the 20th century of basic technology. Radio, telephone, television, telecommunication, internet, wireless, network, now. How those things manifest and in what way those things have affected us is profound. There's another track that converges at the same endpoint, an endpoint that I might consider calling, say, a technology or media-based singularity. That other history is the history of our relationship to photography, our relationship to the camera as a device that is part of our life, our relationship to recording ourselves and making ourselves part of a record. This has been going on since 1900 with the introduction of the Kodak folding camera, a camera that in fact is not that large and rather easy and made to carry around. What's important is that these two trajectories converged at the same time that the network emerged and then was enhanced through social media. So let's pause for a minute and just embrace Marxism, because it's a good thing to do. Guy Debord, who was one of the establishing members of Situationalist International, has this wonderful quote from Society of the Spectacle, which was published in 1967. The fetishism of the commodity, the domination of society by intangible as well as tangible things, attains its ultimate fulfillment in the spectacle, where the real world is replaced by a selection of images which are projected above it, yet which at the same time succeed in making themselves regarded as the epitome of reality. He is speaking from the center of the 20th century because he is observing at that point a convergence of the sense of self, identity, representation, and the influences of images in popular culture. Chicken and the egg scenario. On the left, you have a popular form in the Ozzie and Harriet television series. On the right, an actual American family, same time frame. What's important here, Ozzie and Harriet being a very important television show in our history, in so much as it was born on the radio, transformed onto television, and grew for decades as one of the most popular television shows in America. The soft line or the influence of the ideal representation of the American family in relationship to the representation of an actual family, I believe, is visible in the example. Let's look at what happens after the New Left and the baby boomers become the viewers. Another version of reality that is more akin or more keen to emulate an existing social group appears. In that representation, you see a greater level of naturalism between the synthetic, the narrative, and the real. Finally, we arrive into the present. Now, the present opens the fourth wall entirely as the popular sitcom or synthetic form takes on the properties of the real world in so much as its audience is our audience in the same format. On the left, synthetic. On the right, real. Now, in linguistics, a way of looking at this is a notion of the deixis. Now, the deixis refers to words and phrases such as I, you, or now, and cannot be fully understood without additional contextual information. In this case, the identity of the speaker, I or me, and the speaker's location, here due to being in the now. Now, let's unpack selfies really quickly. From stigma to selfie to spectacle. The selfie, or the idea of the self-authored self-portrait that is then exchanged online, has not come along easy. Its history was deeply stigmatized. The notion of having a photograph of yourself and sharing it to the world was looked down upon. On the far end, you can see the idea of a manually made anonymous photograph used for print in a personal or classified section of a paper. Radical artists such as Nan Goldin, who worked against all of the structures that defined photography in fine art, made a major step by using natural light and using her own camera to take a photograph of herself in a mirror. 2001, Craigslist comes online, and it is looked down upon as it is a space for people to use themselves and solicit themselves in image exchange. However, as the network and technology evolved and social media grew to the point that it included images and timelines, that barrier became thoroughly broken. And a watershed moment in 2014 when the Oscars moved away from the 4:3 aspect ratio of the broadcast and put themselves within social media's frame was a shift in how we understand or were allowed to use the language of the deixis, or the I, in our communications. From that point, everything changes. The individual image is more complex than the individual idea inside of the frame. It is more layered and has greater subtleties and nuance, and I'm going to go through a few examples of how that works. Person. The idea of personhood and identity could be argued that is defined or has been defined by decades of the formation of self through advertising. Smoking is cool. Beer is sexy. Smoking is cool. Beer is sexy. Smoking is cool and beer is sexy. These ideas have been transmitted through popular culture and through advertising for decades. It is no wonder that these same ideas would be embraced in someone's own representation of themselves. These representations reify how advertising and the product has transformed us. A third example is person in place. Person in place is a highly different operation. Here you have global voting: India, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Canada, and America. A highly political use based on person, place, or person and location. The third is a more directly political activist position with hashtag Occupati, which was a direct response to Canadian Senator Don Plett's limitations of trans rights in terms of bathroom use. Here, as an activist movement, going into the bathroom that was limited to you based on federal law, trans activists went into the space either sending direct messages or allowing the visual components of themselves to be the message. And finally, Kara Walker's A Subtlety. 130,000 people in the matter of 2 months go to Creative Times' public art project. Instead of it being limited to the notion of visiting art to have a personal and meditative experience, it becomes a deeply interactive experience for the viewer as it becomes a popular form of communication online. And finally, the third and last version that elucidated all of the components of language at once: person, place, and thing. My choice, looking at the idea of coffee. Now, coffee is a horribly benign concept. However, in our society, when we have been photographing ourselves with coffee, it has not just been a picture of our coffee. In fact, what it has done, it has allowed us to illustrate time and day, location, action, economy of product, aesthetic intention, visual content of place, and class signifiers. 2 groups of coffee drinkers. One taken before 8 a.m., illustrative of labor, illustrative of economy, illustrative of a workplace, a confined workplace. The signifiers laid inside of the images end up becoming greater than the significance of the coffee itself. A group of photographs taken after 11 a.m. holds a completely different narrative. This becomes the product of leisure. It becomes the product of luxury. The images themselves take on composition where the images prior took on information. The result? How do you understand the information of an image? Well, that answer is how you can decode and see the codified value inside of the images we take. We no longer use photographs in a merely aesthetic form. In fact, on a daily basis, we use photographs as a form of direct and concrete language. We are communicating, intentionally or unintentionally, myriad aspects of our life, our self, our meaning. We, in that way, are all photographers ultimately transformed into speakers through our images. Thank you very much.